Sefton Delmer worked for a clandestine British intelligence operation known as the Political Warfare Executive, or PWE. His job was to produce anti-Nazi radio broadcasts that sounded like they had originated within Nazi Germany itself, rather than Great Britain. Delmer's broadcasts were raw, raunchy affairs, rich with pornographic details that shocked his superiors, but they were far more successful than anything the PWE had produced before. Delmer had figured out that sex sells, but not in the way that we think it does. Delmer was born in Germany to British parents in 1904 and spent most of his childhood there. He was the first British journalist to interview Adolf Hitler, and even traveled with Hitler on his private aircraft during a 1932 speaking tour. This access to party elites, coupled with his experiences in Germany as a child, gave him a deep insight into how and why German propaganda worked, and he began to think of counter-strategies. Delmer was recruited into the PWE in 1940 and almost immediately clashed with some of the other operatives there. Before Delmer's arrival, PWE broadcasts consisted mainly of high-minded appeals to democracy read by exiled German intellectuals. Delmer felt that this was a waste of time and resources. In his view, the Germans who believed in democracy were already opposed to Hitler and did not need further convincing. What Delmer and his team wanted to do was skip the politics and go right for the gut. Enter der Chef. Der Chef, which means the boss in German, was supposedly a blunt, gruff-talking, too old to give a damn non-commissioned officer in the German army. Basically, the German version of every guy Clint Eastwood has played since 1986.
Get off my lawn.
Der Chef broadcast was structured to sound like they came from a pirate radio station run by a growing movement of German soldiers disgusted by the incompetence, decadence, and excess of the Nazi elites, particularly the SS, who feasted, while ordinary German citizens struggled with rationing and rank-and-file German soldiers dragged their bellies through the mud. In reality, Der Chef was an actor hired by Delmer to read scripts that, despite their explosive profanity and simmering anger, were meticulously crafted to simultaneously titillate and enrage their listeners. A typical Der Chef broadcast might describe how SS officers had turned a monastery into a brothel, dressed prostitutes in priestly vestments, and held orgies in the chapel. These orgies would then be described in excruciatingly vivid detail. The idea wasn't to get people to stop being Nazis, but to make people start thinking that their leaders had betrayed Nazism. And the hope wasn't that they would form some kind of fifth column, but rather, maybe they'd get a little sloppy in their work at the munitions factory, or get a little greedy with their rations, because hey, screw those old perverts running this country. Der Chef was a huge hit. Based on interviews with POWs and intelligence sources within Germany itself, it's believed to have been one of the most popular radio programs in Germany. Der Chef ran for 700 episodes before Delmer had him captured and shot on air by the Gestapo. Now, that's a series finale.